Welcome back to a continuation of our discussion of the different types of testing that we use in software quality assurance as we continue to talk about how testing fits into our idea of DevOps. So in this video, we're going to jump into functional testing. You may have also heard this as end-to-end testing. And really what this is a type of test that simulates real user behavior from start to finish for whatever the application is supposed to do. So that's clicking buttons, sending data to the backend, receiving responses, and generally just doing what the application is supposed to do to make sure it actually works. And so the main goal is to validate, one, that your features actually work the way users expect. And this is really one of the most comprehensive types of testing because it checks the entire system. So the user is touching the front end, right? They're putting data into forms, they're clicking buttons, they're uploading information. That's getting sent to the back end. We're connecting to the database, we're accessing APIs, we're using all of our framework pieces. And it's not just parts in isolation like we've learned about in other types of testing. So just like everything else that we've learned, there are a lot of tools involved depending on your stack. And I say we're testing end to end, but really what is it that you're testing? Because UI tools like Cypress and Selenium and Playwright, they let you simulate the user interactions in a browser so you don't have to actually manually click on things and fill out forms. And that can be very time consuming. So these UI tools will automate that testing process and let you set up different types of testing profiles so that you can do that quickly. And then for things like API level functional testing, Supertest, which is great for Node.js, Postman, the Newman, Rest Assured, which is a great one for Java. These allow you to test your API endpoints for correctness and behavior. So sometimes you can do this with a user, but we have a lot of tools available that let us automate the process and kind of get it done quickly and make sure that we're being consistent with the way that we're testing. So we talked about what is it? So let's dive into that a little bit. So what exactly is functional testing? Well, we want to validate that the system behaves according to our business and user requirements. And so if we've done our job as software developers, and I get that that's not always a one-man job, so you may have like a business analyst or someone like a project manager who is working to interface with your users, gather requirements, build out those business requirements, and maybe it's in your storyboard exactly what functionality you're trying to achieve, but you're not involved in that process. Maybe you are. In some environments, the software developer is right there with the user, gathering those functional requirements and getting to be part of that process. But what we want to do is make sure that what we built actually behaves the way that the user has asked us to build. Sometimes what happens is we get so kind of in the weeds with building something that we make changes or we decide, hey, it would be really cool if it did it like this. And then the user gets it and it goes, oh, that's not what I thought we were going to do. So functional testing really treats the application like a black box, right? We don't have to know how it works internally. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. As a QA person, maybe you aren't really that great at actually reading code. You don't need to know how it works. You're simply checking if a user provides the right input. Do they get the correct result, right? Can the user log in? Can they view the dashboard? Can they update their profile? And so when we're thinking about functional testing, those are the things that we're thinking about. And it's kind of right there in the name, right? We're functional, our functions. How are they working with our application? So what are we checking? And we say end to end, because functional testing really covers a wide range of interactions and logic. So we want to check our UI and our UX workflows. So are things like, are the forms working? Are buttons working? Can I get to the pages I need to get to? Is something not loading? Is there a missing graphic? All those kinds of things. Then we're looking for business rules. So if the VIP users are supposed to get a discount, is that applied at checkout? Do I see that? How do I see that? Does the user understand what's going on? API behavior. Do endpoints return correct responses and handle edge cases like they should or that they've been designed to do? User roles and permissions. So can users access only what they're supposed to? Can admins get to the pieces they're supposed to? Are there any areas in here where maybe we're being unsafe with things like user tokens? And maybe it opens up your site to being having sensitive information accessed by just regular users. So we want to check those roles and permissions and that our security is correct. And then we're looking at things like system integrations. Are emails being sent from our SMTP server or through a third-party provider? Is there some service that we're sending data to, like a third-party service? Is it responding properly? So this is what we mean when we talk about like functional tests being end-to-end, because it really is so comprehensive to what everything is that is going on in your application. So here's a quick example. This is a Cypress test looking at a JavaScript file. And so testing the UI for login information. And so we open up the login page, we enter credentials, it clicks submit, and then it checks to see if the user is redirected to the dashboard. So this is what I was talking about earlier when I said we have these tools that let us automate this process that simulates the full user logon experience. Here's another example using C# for an API test. It checks that the checkout endpoint in that it posts a JSON payload with the item data, and then it asserts that the response returns a 200 OK. So this is a good way to also see we can test that backend service, that it's calculating and responding correctly, and that things on the API side are working, and we can test that. So we've talked about other types of tests, and let's just do a quick comparison to make sure we understand how functional testing fits in with what we've talked about so far with unit tests and integration tests. So unit tests focus on the smallest building blocks, right? Those single functions or classes. We want to make sure that little piece there, like, does it actually calculate the tax correctly? Does it actually apply the discount? Just that piece, is that working? Then integration tests are checking just how components work together. So we're looking at those modules or those services, and does data get passed between things the way that we think it should? And then a functional test works through the whole system. It simulates that full user journey from end to end, right? Front end to back end. So functional tests really offer the broadest coverage. They're also, because of that, the most complex to maintain, because as things change or you're building things, you can't really functional test until you've gotten to a point that all of those pieces are there. So as you're building, we're doing unit tests. As we're bringing modules online, we're doing integration tests. And then as we're getting closer to delivery, we are performing our functional tests, because we just don't have access to everything that we need to make that work until we get to that point. So big benefits. Maybe we understand kind of intuitively from all this some benefits, but hey, why do we use functional testing? It catches real world issues, right? The real issues that users would experience, like, hey, this box, isn't populating correctly, or when I hit tab, I'm taken to a completely different part of the form. That's really annoying. Or this box isn't taking the data that I thought it would take. This is not in the format I thought it would be. Or I'm not being redirected to the page that I thought I would, or I'm not getting my confirmation email. These are things that real users are going to experience and that you can catch with functional testing. We verify our business rules and our system-wide workflows, so we know that features are being validated across systems, and we can build confidence in our releases. So when you integrate functional testing into your CI/CD pipeline, we can build confidence for that release, knowing that we've checked all of these things and we know that users are not going to have issues with our experience. And really, that's what makes functional tests a key part of ensuring quality across the full user experience. So, some challenges. Of course, functional testing has some challenges that we have to kind of get around or figure out. So one of the big downsides is that they can be slow to run. So it's best reserved for critical workflows like logging in, confirmation emails, the checkout process. They're much more comprehensive. They're much more complex tests than like our unit tests. So if you're putting them in your pipeline, it's going to take a little while for your pipeline to run and perform those tests before you can validate that your build is actually correct and ready to go into production. So, sometimes we think like, oh, a test that takes, 50 milliseconds to run or something isn't that long. Functional tests can actually take minutes. So if you're sitting there waiting to validate your pipeline build for minutes and you have multiple layers of testing, developers can get a little antsy. So these tests can be, we could say, flaky. If UI elements are slow to load, if something changes and you haven't updated your test, when we're using these automated tools, the automation can help speed up the process, but we have to make sure that we've checked that, we didn't rename a box or something. If something's not loading, the test isn't going to proceed. And so we do sometimes have to manually do these tests to check, why is it failing? So we say sometimes that they can be flaky. High maintenance, right? They're harder to maintain than things like unit tests. A small UI change might break many tests. And so it takes a lot more to maintain these and keep them up to date, especially if you're kind of rolling out functional testing very early in your cycle where things really are continuing to move and change in your UI or in your process. Someone renames an endpoint and all hell breaks loose. And so functional tests, they often need realistic test data. So like users and environments and things. So the setup, the initial building of the functional test can be complex as well. So some best practices before we wrap up. We want to make sure that we prioritize important user flows, logins, checkouts, profile updates. Those are the places that generally have a lot of moving parts, a lot of data is moving around, and there's generally a lot more points for failure. And because these tests can be slow, we don't want to run them on everything, so prioritization is important. Keeping your tests clean and isolated. Having a separate place where tests are stored, they're not just hiding in your project somewhere. This is going to help you find them. They're easy to read, they're easy to update. We want to keep the code clean and make sure that they're in a place that everyone can find. You want to use staging or sandbox environments in order to avoid what we call test collisions. So a test collision is when you're running a test and it's in the process of running and another test begins that actually creates a situation that causes the previous test to fail. So if you're using staging, so the first test has to complete before the next test can run, that is a good way to avoid that. Or sandbox environments where other tests cannot be running at the same time and the environment is isolated. That's a huge thing. Tag and group tests. So you have some selective execution and you only run what you need. If I'm a developer and I'm updating the workflow for profile updates, then I don't want to have to run a test about checking out in the system every time I submit a build into the pipeline. So we want to set up tags and groups so that I'm only running the tests that really apply to the code I've just changed. And then automation. Automating them in your CI/CD process. You can also then run them separately from, to keep your pipelines quick. But the automation part of this is really going to help greatly in keeping things moving and making sure that people aren't skipping tests as well. So, summary, right? Functional testing helps us ensure that users can actually interact with our software successfully. From the front end to the back end, things are working like we think they should. They are slower. They are more complex than our unit and integration testing, but they play a vital role in validating real-world behavior and reducing risk in production. So thank you so much for coming to hang out for this video and learning more about functional testing. As we continue in this series, I'll be hitting on more different types of tests and how they integrate into DevOps as we get closer to building our own pipelines. So I hope you're excited for that and you're going to stick around, and I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks so much.